Welcome everybody to this new episode of the Panel Fit Monthly Chat. Today we are here with Philippe Di Salvo, who is a post-doctoral researcher at Università della Svizzera Italiana's Institute of Media and Journalism. Currently he is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Department of Media and Communication. And he does research about whistleblowing, investigative journalism, internet surveillance, and the relationship between journalism and hacking. Today I am reached by a co-host who is a colleague of mine. He's Dimitri Bettoni, who is currently a researcher at the Institute of Future Media, Democracy and Society at the Dublin City University, and the coordinator of the project Digital Public Sphere Journalism in the Age of Surveillance for OBC Transeuropa. Okay, so today we'll hold this interview in a more conversational style than usual. So, but let's start with a couple of questions just to introduce the topics and the work of Philippe in his research. So we have heard of this Pegasus investigation, this issue that hit many journalists in all over the world, and but let's try to simply explain what are how these tools, this spyware, can endanger journalists and their sources, and also let's talk about what is how widespread is the issue of surveillance in journalism, at least for what we are aware of, and how aware are newsrooms and journalists of these kind of threats.
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's very nice to be with you guys this morning discussing these issues. And well, the question you asked me, it's pretty broad, and the best possible way to give you a meaningful answer is to repeat something that has been echoing for years around people who are aware and who are working around surveillance in journalism, and that the most about surveillance in journalism is still to be found out, and that's the main concern of most of the people who are involved in these issues, including journalists when they discuss surveillance, and this is part of the results I've got also from my own research. So for these reasons, it was so important to see the publication of the Pegasus project earlier this summer, because it was one of those moments of reckoning where we got much evidence about how dangerous and widespread the use of spyware technology is. And that's a rare thing. It is rare because having access to details and evidence about how surveillance companies work, it's very difficult. These companies are very secretive and difficult to approach, and they tend also to work very much under the radar for obvious reasons. So having such an impactful and big investigation was fundamental in raising many more questions about how states and private actors are using spyware technologies to target dissidents and journalists. When it comes to journalists, the Pegasus project rang a very dangerous alarm, and we found out evidence that at least 180 prominent journalists have been targeted through Pegasus around the world. And my fear is that this is just the top of the iceberg, and there is so much we still don't know about the use of spyware, that it should be a topic of the utmost urgency for everybody involved in journalism and other issues. When it comes to spyware and Pegasus in particular, the scariest thing is definitely the fact that once someone is a target, once someone is a victim, there is a little that this person can do in order to find out that this person has been put under surveillance through a spyware, because there is absolutely no way of having any evidence that the spyware has been installed on a device without running a very professional and technical forensic analysis of a phone. So in a constellation of surveillance today, and digital surveillance in particular, spyware are really the most dangerous device that is available out there, because they are capable of providing remote access to a device to someone who is attacking a journalist, for instance, and providing this individual or this organization with full access to anything that is stored into a smartphone, for instance, and to all the communication that are passing through the smartphone. And this, as you were already pointing out, is a nightmare scenario when it comes to source protection and to protecting the advancement of an investigation and the safety of the journalists and the sources too. So spyware are really, I would say, the scariest scenario a journalist can think of when it comes to internet surveillance.
Yeah, how about the awareness of newsrooms in general? I know you interviewed some journalists. I don't know if you have an idea of an overview of the field, or.
Well, definitely there has been a learning curve starting with the Snowden revelations in 2013, which may sound strange and still is to me, but it's almost 10 years ago. So it sounds like yesterday, but it's almost now a decade since we entered this post-Snowden world. And that has been definitely the turning point for anything encryption, anything information security in journalism. Before the Snowden revelations, the awareness of even the existence of the problem was extremely limited. And it was just something that the most advanced investigative journalists were aware of. And after the Snowden revelation, this has changed, and there has been definitely some more awareness in newsrooms, and consequently also the adoption of protection strategies, anti-surveillance strategies and tools. But overall, I'm afraid that the awareness is still very low, and most of the newsrooms and journalists have little or no idea about what is going on in the field and what are the risks involved. When it comes to Pegasus, though, we should underline how the use of such a sophisticated spyware is something very high-ranking. So that, for instance, spyware like Pegasus have been used to target very prominent and very exposed and outspoken journalists in the field of national security, or those who were investigating very powerful forms of powers in their own countries. So the use of spyware overall is something very sophisticated that needs to be done in the perspective of the attackers for a reason. So spyware, it is definitely the most scariest scenario, but it is something that usually happens for targeting someone who is in a specific position, who is investigating against specific powers. So it is not something that should concern everybody into this conversation, but surveillance in general, beyond spyware and mass surveillance in particular, are instead topics of very important urgency for everyone involved in journalism.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if Dimitri wants to add something, or but before giving the floor to Dimitri, a technical note. Philip, could please pay attention not to touch your microphone while you speak, because it makes
sorry about that, guys. Sorry.
Funny noises.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. Thank you, Philip, for your introduction to this very interesting topic, and thank to everybody for being here. So my first question for you would be, you use the word fear. And fear is an emotional condition that definitely affects journalistic capabilities to carry productive and successful work. And one element that made me think about this spyware industry is that the psychological impact of this industry is not strictly related to having a spyware on your mobile phone, but is around the possibility of having such a thing on your devices. So you do not need to actually be targeted with surveillance techniques or technologies to have an impact on journalistic work. The opaqueness and invisibility of these techniques are very much the first and the scariest weapon they carry along. So what is your take in this sense? Because you also mentioned the possibility of conducting forensic analysis and the difficulties of doing that. So many journalists do fear that it is impossible to assess the existence of such technology on their devices. So it is impossible to defend yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I totally share this view about spyware, and the use of spyware is definitely not done just to have access to the information. It is something that it's done to have also consequences in the real lives of those who are targeted. So in the case of journalists, they are definitely a weapon to silence them, to put them in a corner of silence, or worse. If we think about the story of Jamal Khashoggi, for instance, we need to be aware that in non-democratic countries, surveillance against journalists sometimes also leads to having journalists killed. So that is definitely something that should be stressed. Surveillance techniques against journalists are definitely for information gathering, but they have broader goals and targets. And installing fear is also something that is strictly related to installing a spyware. And the problem you were saying about the opaqueness and the invisibility of these technologies are definitely a core issue when it comes to this. I've been working on a research which is hopefully coming out soon about how investigative journalists perceive surveillance here in Europe, and it's an explorative research about ICIJ members around Europe discussing how their work has changed in light of surveillance revelations, and they all say this: it is complicated to have a full assessment who might be surveilling me, who might be willing to put their eyes on me and on my work. And the surveillance market also is becoming commodified. So access to tools like spyware or other surveillance software is becoming easier and also cheaper. Of course, we are still discussing very high-ranking operations, so it's not something that you buy for 20 euros or 100 euros, but it is still becoming very much more accessible to various players. And the problem is that this is no longer only something that state actors can do. Also, private actors can access these kind of tools. There was recently an investigation by the Swedish public television about how banks in Sweden were using spyware to monitor journalists too. So journalists who are investigating offshore economies, who are investigating powerful industrial conglomerates or corporations, may be exposed to these dangers because their objects of investigation may have access to surveillance technology. So when the Snowden revelations were published, there was this dismissive take on surveillance, like, well, only if you are covering national security or the intelligence apparatus, then you have to fear about these things. But that's no longer the case. Access to this technology is becoming easier, as we were saying, and consequently, there will always be a big question mark about may the object of my investigation being using a spyware against me. And that's exactly what you were saying. That sense of fear, this sense of paranoia, which is inevitably raising around journalists when it comes to having these big questions in the mind, is something that may have long-term consequences on the practice of journalism itself, and it may lead even to censorship. It may lead to have some voices turned down, and definitely have an impact on the kind of information that the public will be served with. Last week, 2 weeks ago actually, I was in Modena in Italy for DIG Festival, which is an investigative journalism festival that I co-organized with other people, and we awarded Forbidden Stories for their work on the Pegasus project, especially for this reason, because they were able to unmute some voices, they were able to raise awareness about these issues, and I hope that this will also have a push for regulation. This will have a push for having more awareness about the issue, and have also some consequences when it comes to these companies basically selling digital weapons that are used, and now we have evidence against journalists and another form of accountability providers. So this sense of fear, though, is absolutely the case. There is a metaphor, which is the one of the black boxes that Frank Pasquale has used to describe how surveillance technologies operate. And I think that the surveillance market is a black box. We know that it exists. We know that it is selling products to various agents and various providers, but we have very little information about who they are. And definitely NSO, the producer of Pegasus, is one of the most powerful, is one of the most known also companies in this area, but it's just one. And Pegasus is just one of this spyware, which are available for everybody who wants to purchase them. So we need more of this. We need more evidence. We need to open more black boxes in order to have more accountability and information about what is going on in the market, because this is the only way we have to have more facts, to have more evidence, and consequently to fight this sense of fear and paranoia, which is inevitably impacting on the work of journalists all over the world.
Yeah, this leads me to another question I had in mind. That is, like to put a bit in context, also the profession of journalists, and how the conditions in which they work on a daily basis. So I guess there could be some difference between freelancers and journalists who work for big newsrooms in how they perceive the level of paranoia, and how they feel the threat that could be on them. So it's like also the conditions, the freelancers condition part of the issue, and maybe precarity, if you want to call it like that, an issue in making journalists more or less easily targeted.
Yeah, it is definitely an issue. And what the research in the field is showing is that there are some newsrooms which are more aware about what is going on when it comes to surveillance. So especially in the US or here in the UK, the big players in the journalism market have at least some initiatives. They have some practices and tools and strategies to protect their own journalists against surveillance. But of course, one thing is being a journalist at the New York Times, where you have a structure, where you have a hierarchy, where you have a newsrooms and the resources that you need in order to feel safe. And one thing is being a freelancer who is working on their own, who is working alone and with extremely limited resources when it comes to time, money, and other things. So this is, again, a very important issue, and I'm glad that you're raising it, because ultimately it comes to a threat assessment. So every journalist should be aware of who might be the player who is trying to put them under surveillance and consequently take actions. Not all journalists need to have whistleblowing platforms. Not all journalists need to have very very widespread use of encryption on a daily basis. Maybe you only need encryption in certain situations when it comes to dealing with certain sources, etc. So the message of this talk, I don't want to be like, we are all under surveillance, there's no hope, and let's surrender to paranoia. That would be problematic. So, but definitely, freelancers are left alone when it comes to this, because this is definitely an investment of time. It is sometimes an investment of money in order to have the tools, to have the strategies, to have everything you need to feel safe. And this is something where more intervention should be done also from the state. I think that there should be programs of assistance, programs of supporting for freelancers, because, for instance, against spyware, the only strategy to feel very safe is to switch smartphones on a regular basis in order to make sure that that specific device is not infected, and if it is infected, it's put aside and substituted with a new one. And this is very expensive, and for freelancers this can be very, very problematic. Again, if you're working for a big organization, then you can assume that your employer will assist you and help you in having all the devices you need. But if you're working on your own, that becomes at least a problem. So yeah, as for other problems we are facing in journalism, also for surveillance, freelancers are definitely the most exposed to these issues. Also because what we learned from the Pegasus project investigation is that sometimes those who get targeted with spyware are not the journalists themselves, but the people around them. So in the case of Khashoggi, for instance, there is evidence that people coming from the family and the closest circles of people to the journalists were targeted with spyware. So maybe the journalist has some information security background, has some information security skills, and that could make targeting them directly more difficult, but the people around them may be even more exposed than them. And this is definitely something that should concern everyone around journalism, because the point of attack cannot be, definitely in every case, the journalists themselves, but also people around them. And this is, of course, exposing even more people to the problem. And if you apply this to freelancers, well, it is clear that the problem is even more trickier and problematic.
Well, if I may step in on this issue, I'm very glad that Philip mentioned the fact that surveillance is not an issue strictly related to journalists or activists, but it actually involves all the people surrounding them, including their family members. And so, because it gives the sense that this is not an issue that can be addressed just by training journalists. It requires a different level of approach. And so here goes my question. You mentioned, Philip, the necessity of addressing the surveillance industry and its opaqueness. And that can be done in two ways, either regulating it. So my question here would be, in your opinion, what kind of regulations do we need at national level, European level, international level? But also we need to create bodies that are capable of actual oversight on not just the industry and its import-export dynamics and trades, but also the use of such technology. And the idea here, probably, I want your opinion about this, is that responsibility does not end once you've sold your product. You carry a longer responsibility even after that. And so laws and regulations should reflect this level of responsibility. I will give you an example. Do you think that ad hoc parliamentary commissions specifically monitoring the deployment and use of such technologies can be an effective answer to this problem?
Well, the issue of regulation is definitely crucial, and there are some rules around, for instance, the export of surveillance technologies that have been put in place by the European Union to prevent surveillance technologies to be sold to non-democratic countries, etc. But we learned from investigations that this is easy to bypass. There was a very powerful investigation by Al Jazeera, I think 3 years ago, called Spy Merchants, that show clearly how European companies were capable of selling digital surveillance to Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries by using intermediaries in other parts of the world, and definitely by simply hiding the transactions in this way. So the problem is how to monitor these gray zones where still the export of technologies can happen, and oversight is the answer, as you were already mentioning. The problem, which is strictly connected to the technologies themselves, is that spyware and other surveillance technologies are dual-use technologies. So, of course, law enforcement agencies can use them when it comes to investigate crimes. And law enforcement agencies, even in Italy, are using spyware to conduct investigation into certain kinds of crimes. And the producers are the same. So the producers who are selling and purchasing spyware technologies to legitimate law enforcement agencies are then also those who are selling these technologies to other not so legitimate, in my view, clients, like states where democracy is not established, or authoritarian regimes. So dual use is definitely the issue here, because it is easier to say, let's put a ban on nuclear weapon, because there is no legitimate use of nuclear weapons except of killing thousands of people. But when it comes to spyware, it is trickier, because law enforcement may still need this to investigate certain crimes. And that's precisely the point when then the conversation ends, because if we need to make sure that law enforcement agencies have access to these things, then we need to have them on the market. My view is a little bit different. I think that with the exclusion of certain very limited cases, like investigations into terrorism or investigation into mafia or organized crimes and other very high-ranking crimes, there shouldn't be any use of spyware, because they're very almost impossible to monitor for the reasons we just discussed. And so I think there should be a very strict regulations around who is capable of using these tools, who can purchase these things, and the limitations should be put on the companies themselves. So for real, they shouldn't be selling this to other clients than certain specific approved clients. But how to enforce this is then still problematic. Also because companies in this area are usually very connected to state actors. We know this for NSO, for how it was included in the investigation. The company is very close to the Israeli state. So sometimes they're really so close that it's difficult to put a demarcation mark between the two areas. So it is definitely a very complex issues to be solved, and to answer your question briefly, it's very difficult. But I think that there should be an international regulation, maybe on the United Nations levels, in deciding what are effectively the acceptable uses of spyware, and that should be a red line. But how this can be then enforced, it's even more complex for the reasons we just saw, because monitoring and oversighting these companies is extremely difficult. And I'm not an expert on regulations, so I'm afraid I'm not providing the best answer here. But in principle, I think this should be the starting point.
Yeah, I take the opportunity, since I guess that we have experts on regulations among the audience, because I know some of the names here. If you want to raise your hand and step in the discussion, feel free to do so. So it's just a message for the audience. And yeah, I was looking also at your research on whistleblowing platforms, and I was interested in what are the worries in using such platforms as described by journalists of people about the use and the security of the data they provide through these platforms. It's mentioned in your research, but yeah, I'd be curious about this. This kind of worries that I guess there are.
Well, whistleblowing platforms and the software that can be used to create them, so basically Secure Drop and Global Leaks, which are the most diffused software nowadays, they are technologies to secure communications from sources to journalists and vice versa. So they are specifically created in order to have safe channels for sources to contact journalists and have all their conversations protected by the strongest standard of encryption. But that's what they do, and that's where their contribution ends. It is a massive contribution. It is crucial in order to protect the sources in particular, because they can speak out anonymously and without leaving traces of their own communications. But this is it. And it is huge, but again, it's just one thing that can be done to protect one specific component of journalism, which is source protection. The problem with any information security software is that 100% security is something that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist as a principle because although Secure Drop, Global Leaks, Signal, and all the other software that are available are constantly tested, they are constantly verified and upgraded and audited. So they are 99.7 periodic % secure. 100% will it's not the case. It's not the case because those who have the capacity to attack journalists, those who have the surveillance capacities, will definitely always be one step ahead of those who need to protect themselves from these things. And then, apart from this, also human errors are the most frequent scenario where anti-surveillance practices can fail. You can use all the tools you want, but then if you confess to someone over a beer that you are the sources of an investigation, then encryption can do very limited things to protect yourself. And no of these tools are silver bullets to solve the problem. They are part of an ecosystem of solution that can and need to be created when it comes to security, but this is just one thing. And when it comes to whistleblowing platforms, we should also stress the point that they are very effective in being safe communication channels. They are very effective in providing a point of contact to sources who don't know how to speak out, but they are just a sourcing method. They're just something you can use to have access to people and information, but then how the journalistic work itself is structured and done, it's pretty classic. I mean, you just receive documents, information in a very encrypted and secure way, but then how you verify the documents, how you speak again with your sources, how you structure your fact checking, how you provide additional information is journalism as it has always been. So also in this thing, I think that encryption tools should be framed in this way, because sometimes there is this false analysis that is done that since I have encryption, I will have the next Snowden ringing at my bell. That is not the case. I mean, Snowden has been one out of, I don't know, a billion cases, and most of the things that comes through digital whistleblowing platforms is meaningless, as much most of the telephone calls that journalists receive from potential sources are. So it is just a way of having more secure conversations with the sources, but they are not kind of the Stargate to have access to, I don't know, which crucial leaks and things. They help, they're fundamental, they protect the both ends of a journalistic exchange, but we shouldn't look at them as the magic one that will bring the next Snowden into our inbox. That's definitely something they don't do.
Okay. Dimitri?
Yeah, if I may shoot like one last question here to Philip and bring the conversation maybe to a more theoretical level. I hope we would not bore the people here with us. I know, Philip, that you base your work extensively on the work on another surveillance scholar, David Lyon. And there are a couple of key concepts in David Lyon's work that I'd like to bring in. The first one is trust. So I'd like to hear your take about the relationship between journalism, who thrives on trust and a trustful relationship with the audience, and surveillance technologies on one hand. But also another key concept in surveillance, in David Lyon's work on surveillance, is the question around caring form of surveillance. So surveillance technologies that can have a positive impact or represent an opportunity. And here we are talking about journalism. So do you think that surveillance technologies, probably not spywares, but other forms of surveillance technologies, can represent an opportunity rather than a threat for journalism?
Well, thanks for quoting David Lyon, which is definitely one of the masters of this area, and absolutely someone whose work I use a lot in mine as well. And trust is definitely the core issue when it comes to the impact of surveillance on journalism. We were discussing this a little bit also before, but the absence of transparency about surveillance powers is the problem, I would say. And we don't have that transparency from state actors. The Snowden revelations clearly shown that. We had no idea about which were the capacity when it comes to internet surveillance of most the democracies around the world, starting from the US, but including most of the European countries. And unfortunately, in the wake of the Snowden revelations, some European countries have even given themselves more surveillance powers when it comes to mass surveillance. This happened in France, in the UK, in Italy as well, in Switzerland, etc. And there is very limited transparency about how this works. The Italian case is crucial, I think. Italy has extended its own data retention for up to 6 years by approving a law that was discussing many things, including safety of elevators in buildings. There was a line somewhere that automatically extended data retention up to 6 years. That we know is in contrast with European laws about data retention. So that's how usually surveillance powers are introduced by state actors. And then there is the big question of mark that we were saying before about private actors having access to surveillance technologies, which is even shadier and obscure than state actors, where you can have at least some forms of transparency. So trust is definitely a core issue when it comes to journalism and surveillance, but also when it comes to surveillance at large. There are forms of surveillance which are beneficial. That's absolutely clear, that's absolutely true. And surveillance itself has this component of care that you were saying, and some forms of surveillance are purely positive. I mean, we take care of people, we surveil others in order not to have them get hurt. So that's the starting point of what surveillance is. But surveillance is absolutely easy to be abused. It's absolutely easy to become something else. And in particular, surveillance is also frequently related to crisis. So we saw this with 9/11 20 years ago. Everything we everything that emerged through the Snowden revelation started on September 12th, 2001, and all the surveillance programs that were introduced in the US were introduced following 9/11. So the crisis always have an impact on how surveillance is perceived, and we see this with COVID, with the pandemic. We have been forced to be put more under surveillance in order to monitor and prevent the spread of the pandemic, which is something we can all agree on that it's needed, it's important. I'm not a fan of COVID passports, for instance, but I think they may be beneficial in a specific time frame for specific reasons, and then that's it. So the point of this should be that some forms of surveillance may be beneficial in a specific context, but that should be clear. This is the context, this is the time frame, this is why we're doing this, and once the emergency is over, we get rid of all these things. And unfortunately, this doesn't happen all the time. We see this with facial recognition, for instance, which has been introduced all over by exploiting fears and dangers who are overreaching in specific contexts. In Italy, this is happening in small towns, like my hometown in Como. They introduced facial recognition in a public park where nothing happens. I can tell you, I've been living there for decades, and nothing really happens there. But still, facial recognition was introduced just because maybe we have a technology that we can use. So there is a lot of technological determinism as well when it comes to surveillance technologies that frame these things as needed, as fundamental, as absolutely unmissable. Well, then in reality, that's not the case. So again, we are discussing dual use of technologies, which is always the point in this. And even when surveillance technologies are beneficial, they should be put under strict oversight, because the abuse is always around the corner, and it's way easy to exit from the acceptable beneficial area and enter something else. In the case of my town, I think that facial recognition was absolutely an abuse, and I was very happy to see that the investigation I did with others was bringing to the shutting down of the thing, because it was absolutely out of any reasonable use.
Yeah, it's very interesting also to note how the responsibilities both of governments and of journalists in informing on the different surveillance systems you mentioned. Like in Italy specifically, there is this ambush against the COVID pass, which is, as you said, probably a reasonable solution for a limited time frame and a limited use, while there is not the same worry against these surveillance, these biometric systems that are enforced and that, on which there is no time limitation and scope of use, etc. So it's interesting also how the reception can change based on many different factors, which involve for sure the government, the trust in government, and the ability of governments to communicate with people, and also the role of journalists, I guess, is crucial here. So I don't know if Dimitri if you want to add like a final remark, or someone else from the audience wants to make a quick question before wrapping up this encounter.
Well, I'd rather leave the floor to other questions. If there are none, I will step in with one last bullet.
Yeah, I guess you can go ahead.
Okay, then my last question would be, that the Pegasus case represented sort of milestone, as you mentioned before, in shedding the light on this very shady and opaque environment. But you mentioned also the importance of keeping an eye on non-state actors. Like, it's somehow ironically said that the main threat comes from states, who are supposed to be the ones that protect journalism. But we need to pay attention to non-state actors, because this technology is becoming progressively cheaper, accessible, and so on. You mentioned the case of banks in Sweden. Part of the Pegasus investigation revolved around drug cartels in Mexico targeting journalists with spyware. I personally, in my research activities, become aware of companies involved in the cryptocurrency market using spywares targeting journalists investigating. So an already shady environment overlapping with another shady environment. So in your opinion, what are the main threats that comes from non-state actors, and how can we, as researchers and journalists, and according to your experiences, what is the best way to proceed in our researches and investigations?
Well, again, the problem with private actors is that, contrarily to state actors, where there are some forms of accountability possible, I mean, it is complex, but you can fill a FOIA request and have access to contracts that were done by state actors with surveillance technology suppliers, for instance. It's something you can do with a company or with another private actor involved in this. So the possibility of having actual accountability and transparency is even more limited when it comes to private actors. When it comes to how to raise awareness around this and how researchers can contribute, I think that we need alliances between academia, ONGs, and journalists themselves. So I think that the Pegasus project, in this sense, has also been very interesting for how it was conducted. I mean, of course, it started with journalistic investigations, that forbidden stories coordinated with 16 media partners around the world. But we shouldn't absolutely forget that they asked also for assistance to Amnesty International, which has a very important technical department who corroborated the findings of the investigation with technical analysis on the phones of the victims, and also with the Citizen Lab, which is a research center hosted by the University of Toronto, which is also doing extremely important awareness and activist, I would say, work when it comes to shedding light on how spyware have been around for decades, and not for decades, for years, sorry. And of course, they have also done some initial work into Pegasus, and what we knew about Pegasus emerged thanks to the work of researchers, and the Pegasus project then was contributing with even more evidence to something that was suspected, at least by researchers. So definitely, if I look at the issue in the perspective of having awareness for the public, of having solutions when it comes to regulations, we need these alliances, because it's a combination of skills, it's a combination of capacities that only when journalists, activists, and researchers working together, we can see fully operational at full speed. But then I think that researchers themselves can be very helpful in the complexity of this scenario, because I think that, for instance, when it comes to academic research in journalism studies, we are still at the beginning. There is still little work coming out from the academia in this area. What we have is great, and it's becoming even more visible, but we need more of it. So there should be also the contribution of the academia in this area, because the level of depth, the level of analysis that the academia can provide, it's needed in order to have an understanding of how journalists at least can have access to the problem, can have more awareness around what is going on. So we need the work of researchers in this area, and then maybe use what comes out from the academia to assist other journalists conduct investigations like it was done for the Pegasus project. I think that the threats that surveillance is causing to journalists needs so much democratic oversight that we need all these forces coming together at least sometimes in order to have the needed push from all these areas and maybe have a positive change of things. Otherwise, as we were saying before, the attackers will always been one step ahead, and without oversight, without accountability, I'm afraid this is a battle that we are going to lose. Sorry for the pessimistic take at the end about the conversation.
Yeah, great way to end our conversation. No, thank you very much. Before saying goodbye, some self-promotion, because next week we will co-organize a series of conferences, which is called Data Dilemmas, dealing with data and investigating the consequences. And on the first day, on October 19, we'll have Sandrine Rigaud from Forbidden Stories and one of the journalists who were targeted by Pegasus. So it's self-promotion, but it's not off topic. Okay, so, and I put the link to the mini website in the chat. So everyone here is invited, of course. And okay, thank you very much, Philip, for being with us. And
thanks for having me, for the great question. It was great to see you, at least on the internet. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thank you, Dimitri, for joining me with this on this interesting conversation. Goodbye.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.